we'll hand it over to tonight's presenters. So Damon and Daniel, please take it away.
Thank you all so much for having us here. Before we hop into talking about what we do, I'm going to pass it to Damon to set the stage a little bit.
Welcome to the journey to freedom. Those before us left lessons, we gonna learn and repeat them. We not gonna follow directions because we know that they cheating. The game has been rigged, but into the coding you'll beat it. The North Star ain't the brightest, but it's the one that you seeing. Just follow your spirits because we was born with the secrets. We gonna find what we seeking. Hearts gonna keep beating. Every day is the party. It don't just start on the weekend. We going harder than cement, marching, discarding our demons, bombarding the garden, led by the daughters of Eden. We are all that we needed, clever but never defeated. We do it better together. They want us broken, competing. We defining this moment and giving life a new meaning. We defying the owners, open and bold with our treason. Kids is smoking and drinking because we be coping with trauma, drama, mama fussing, cussing, and little cousins be bleeding. All the homies be tweaking, getting locked up for no reason. Hunting us all year, we not just cuffed in the season, catching feelings, healing, but still throwing shade in the evening. If you saw the impossible, would that make you believe it? Boarding up our schools, they still don't want us reading, trying to shut us up because they don't want us screaming, but we done woke up now. We'll show them what we've been dreaming. Oh, they got us messed up. But here come the Redeemer. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Damon Williams. I am grateful to be joined here by one of my dearest partners in decriminalization, Mr. Daniel Kissinger himself, the wizard with the wave files.
I'm Daniel. I'm the other half. That's the first time we've gotten that intro. I love that.
Yeah, I just made that up off the top. Wizard with the wave files.
The wizard with the wave files. I have a new Twitter bio. But we are the co-creators and co-hosts of Ergo, which is a podcast and movement media hub here in Chicago that reshapes the culture of our city and beyond for the more liberatory and creative. Since 2015, Damon and I have been facilitating long-form interviews and conversations with movement workers, activists, organizers, cultural workers, artists, folks doing the work of reimagining what our city can look like, how it runs, and how we can build toward a future where people's needs are met and we move with care rather than punishment. Yeah, that's I think the very broad strokes. Dan, you wanna do a little more context setting, a little origin story?
Yeah, so for us, as we're not that young no more. Once we get started.
We were when we started.
Yeah. we were the young folks. But for us, coming into our understandings of adulthood at a time here in Chicago where there were really two overlapping, emergent, dynamic, world-changing movements that we found ourselves in community with. And so one first, I think primary was an artistic cultural community centered around independent hip hop and grassroots theater work and poetry and spoken word, and as well as a little bit of independent filmmaking. There was a creative community that was forming and blossoming, and at the same time, in the fall of 2014 into the top of 2015, we saw the beginning of the emergence of what we know as the movement for Black Lives, or people often refer to it as the Black Lives Matter movement. But this, resistance mode of liberatory organizing that people aged 16 to 45 in the city and around the world were taking to a new height. So we found ourselves in the midst of that. Me and this, handsome fellow went to college together and had a respect and had collaborated on a few projects. And so as a Chicagoan, and Daniel as like a loving and respectful transplant, we kind of wanted to, build our two perspectives of this is my home and this is a space that Daniel's entering. What does it look like to document in real time what feels clear to us to be historical movements? And in that process, we've now been doing it 7 to 8 years, and see our work not just as an auxiliary or an offshoot of movement, but actually how do we document, how do we create narrative and story, as well as provide the means of production to more folks who are directly impacted and directly addressing the systemic imbalances that shape and affect all of our lives, especially here in Chicago. So going from participant documentarians to active shapers of transformation in our city has been like the journey we've been on from 2015 to now.
Yeah, and so much of that work from the beginning was rooted in a certain ethic, but over time we've really built kind of a methodology and a framework behind doing this work as a form of contribution. A lot of times when people are doing documentarian work, media work, journalism work, especially on the civic end, there's a lot of conversation around amplification, which is wonderful. And you know, the thinking that I think is behind that is that we need to be making the voices that are charting new visions for our communities more visible, more audible, louder. And there's a lot of value in that. But by framing it around this idea of amplification, it removes the subjectivity of the person doing the amplifying. You know, if you turn up an amp and you're playing guitar, the higher you turn it, the more distorted it gets. And so the person who's monitoring that has to be making adjustments to make sure that that voice is coming through clear. And so I think we try to be really intentional about the subjectivity of us as the people doing that, you know, what initially started out in our language as amplification. And now I think we think about more as contribution of, you know, if we are a member of this movement community, how do we bring that ethic into the media work we do, not just what people hear, but the process, how we do it, and how do we make room for and acknowledge the ways that our individual personal subjectivities are shaping how that's done.
I want to talk about some of the projects we're working on, but I need to take a second. This is I'm breaking the fourth wall here for y'all checking this
I knew you
out.
were going to do this.
I'm impressed. I just want to say, Daniel, just really
we've been talking about this.
We've talked about these things, subjectivity, amplification. We've done this 1,000 times, and he just pulled that guitar amplification thing just off the top of his head. I mean, maybe he prepared, but
no.
Tell me, Captain. No, that was great. So for everybody viewing, you just got some fresh sauce. Feel free to jump into here as I spout some names off, Daniel. But what's been really exciting, and I kind of named it, is that we are in community and we are just alive at a time where there is really dynamic work happening. And so the title of this is Divesting from Despair. And we believe that the people that we have helped to, you know, people we've been in conversation with and helped to document their work and story are embodiments of this process of moving us back towards hope. So a lot of times when we talk about big issues, big systems, or we can even call them big problems, often in my experience, the way that is documented and proliferated through media, whether, you know, that's our local, you know, single digit 2579, you know, folks, whether that's the big papers, you know, or even other long form new media, what I take away often is a compounding of issues that feel insurmountable, or that lead me to anger, or that lead me to frustration, through one who is deemed worthy to tell the story, the limits to how that story is willing to be framed, and I would say hesitancy to connect dots that need to be connected. And so by taking a different approach of, instead of, you know, how do we focus on how bad disinvestment is from the South Side, in the context of that story, if we center the people who are doing the work to transform and to make freedom from those oppressive realities, you actually see that there are so many possibilities, and that there's so many opportunities to create better futures, and that hope is actually a better politic than despair or than anger or frustration or detachment. So what does it look like to create a meta conversation that is inviting folks in to this discourse of changing the world and changing ourselves and changing our environment? So I want to name some of the people. You know, I feel like we're using a lot of big words, a lot of framings. I want to give some like touch points of people that have been a part of this archive or this larger meta narrative, because to me, we're at about like 320 episodes, and some of them take different shapes and form. But it is a larger fabric that we're hoping to offer as a document for this generation and future generations. So, you know, at the top of the list, very honored to have talked to Angela Davis, Barbara Ransby, Eve Ewing, artists such as Jamila Woods, Tasha, Kenya, Saba, and the Pivot Gang, Charlene Carruthers, Go Asha Ransby Sporn. Go ahead if you want to
I'll
throw in some
throw
highlights in there.
and then we've also have a bunch of folks who are not based in
Brandon
Chicago.
Johnson, obviously.
Oh yeah, we had Brandon on back
Twice.
Pardon me. We have Mayor-elect Johnson on back in like 2018, back when
As
he was
running
just
for
Cook County Commissioner, and then we were able to reconnect with him during the mayoral campaign. But we also have, the show is very much place-based and centered here in Chicago, but we very strategically put an and beyond on there. One, not to limit the conversations that we could steward, but also because we see this connection between the whole and the particular. We see the ways that what happens in Chicago informs the rest of the country, and vice versa, the ways that Chicago serves as a microcosm for what's happening on a larger scale. So the wonderful writer and poet Hanif Abdurraqib is someone who's been on a couple times. Vivian Sensor, who's a brilliant culture worker, organizer, who's based all over the place, but is rooted in Palestine and runs the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library, in which heirloom seeds are moved through the Palestinian community, enabling those traditions and crops to stay vibrant, alive, and passed down as a form of collective memory. And the reason we're listing all these names is not just to name drop how cool we are. It's because the whole point of building this show, and when we say contribution, one of the main contributions was that for people who are interested in the work happening toward liberation in the city, don't feel like they're an active participant yet, but want to know where to start, want to know who's doing this important work and what are the pathways in, and what do you need to know. We want the show to serve as a vehicle of invitation. And that's been true from the first episode all the way to now, even as those communities have shifted. This is supposed to be, I think sometimes, especially because we have so many episodes, it can at first feel intimidating when people look at the list of all the episodes, and they may see names they don't know. But what I think, once you start listening, once you jump into that archive, the message and the tone is always one of invitation. And that's part of what Damon's talking about around hope. I think it's important to break down that word a little bit, because I think sometimes it gets inaccurately lumped with optimism. And in media projects, or sometimes naivete. Right, sometimes people are like, oh, we're tired of talking about the bad things. We're going to do some like positive human interest stories, right? We're going to tell good news. And that's not what we're advocating for. That can be, meaningful. But what people call like human interest stories, I always find like the least interesting stories about humans. I think what we're talking about is not just talk about the good parts, still have the conversation about these systems of harm, these structures of power that are causing this harm. But rather than centering them, centering the humanity of the people who are trying to reshape them. And through telling their story with them, it makes the room to talk about those systems of power in a way that isn't as weighted. It frames it already in the work happening to challenge it, rather than in the weight of those systems. Because whether that's now, 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago, there are always people doing this work to challenge, resist, reshape, reimagine, rebel, build revolution. And often, as a historical archive, it's hard to find those stories, and that's very intentional. And so part of what we're trying to do is intentionally build that archive, one for people now trying to find their way in, but for people 10, 20, 50 years from now to know exactly what was happening in this city in this pivotal time, and the lessons that they can learn from it, and the lineages that they can claim and work in the spirit of.
Daniel's on fire today. I just want y'all to know.
I just had a delicious salmon bowl that we made here.
Really
so those omega-3s are flying in my brain.
So I want to talk about, I keep alluding to wanting to, let you guys know some projects that we're doing that are in flow and will be coming out soon, and we want everybody to be very excited about. And this is a interesting and somewhat grueling time for us. We are releasing some of the biggest projects we've ever done. But I also want to offer that the work of Ergo, of Respair, the larger entity we are launching that will be more of an umbrella organization, is much more than our podcast, or much more than just the audio that you can play through a digital streaming platform. And in spaces such as this, or with people who want to create media themselves, learning how to be facilitators and educators of and around media has taught us some really important lessons. So on the show, we really pride ourselves in curating a conversation and getting into some interesting dialogue and getting to a place that folks would never get otherwise because of how we shape the conversation. And through that, we realized that there were some skills we shared and we're building together, and that they transfer to all organized space. And so we use the word organized all the time to like talk about, social justice, political organizations, but our life is organized all the time. So whether that is our workspace, whether that's the spaces where we do formal learning, whether that's our household, whether those are, how we gather in community, all of that is organized. And that organization happens through dialogue and conversation. And what we do not usually account for in our day-to-day relationships is that our social and positional power informs the way we talk to each other. So like at the simplest base level, me and Daniel as two cishet men who are facilitating conversations, especially when we're talking to women, femme, gender nonconforming, and other non-binary family members, it is important for us to make sure that we are not cutting off a femme voice or interrupting or assuming what they're saying and stealing the energy of the conversation and recentering our position or what, where we want to go. And that skill and that understanding of how our position shows up and how we talk to each other, and that we actually have to, one, account for that and then counteract how that power shows up, allows us to have more humanizing relationships. So the thing that we've learned and talked about on mic, how to talk to people, and have taught to youth organizations, but have also gone to classrooms, have also gone to workspaces, have also gone to movement spaces, to talk to people about this notion of humanizing dialogue and how do we actually build the muscles of active listening and responding with an ethic of care and nurturing that allows us to do the type of things that we're documenting in the first place. So I want to shout out that ethic and that philosophy of approach, because as we're talking to you today, it's not just listen to our great podcast, even though you should really listen to our great podcast. What we are saying is that we have found a seed of how humans should relate to each other, and that dialogue is a political tool and an artistic practice.
Yeah, and why it's so important is because for a long time we said this in the negative. I'm going to say it in the positive, of especially when talking about how to reshape our world in ways that account for and challenge structural power. If we don't, in the conversation it's about that, account for that power, the things we build will simply replicate that. And on the flip side, if we do our best to account for that, and it's not always going to be perfect, but if we do make an honest attempt and show transparency, that conversation itself can serve as a model for the world that you're trying to build. It makes it possible to build the ideas and the processes for a world in which, patriarchal gender, racial capitalism isn't at the foundation of the systems that we build, because within that microcosm of the conversation, it wasn't at the center of how that conversation went, or at least it was accounted for. And so that's kind of our big theory push. And that's evolved over time and has come in, like we said, in dialogue with so many people. It wasn't something that Damon and I invented. It was something that we received through these conversations. But like Damon said, I think we should give a little idea of the work we have coming up, which is in many ways like the most fully realized versions of what we're talking about. So after having done the show and consulting on other people's podcasts and doing this facilitation, we realized that the podcast itself, what was on air, was really just one component of the work we were doing, and we needed to create an umbrella structure that would contain both our work and also make it possible for other movement participants and movement organizations to make media in ways that were easier than the many years of trial and error that Damon and I went through. So how do we build infrastructure that makes that possible? So you're getting a little bit of a sneak peek here on these. We haven't publicly announced them all, but on June 24th, we're launching our new organization, which is called Respair Production Media. Respair, as you may have guessed from the title, is it's an archaic word that's the inverse of despair. It means a return to hope. And we're hoping that this organization is really a landing place, like I said, for our work, but really becomes a hub of this movement media ecosystem that enables this really vibrant ecosystem to thrive. Within that, we're launching 3 new media projects over the summer. The first is a limited series with Eve Ewing, who's a brilliant scholar, writer, and artist, called Guaranteed, which is a 7-part series about the human impact of guaranteed income and what it makes possible in people's lives. That's coming out on July 15th. And then at the end of July, we're releasing a podcast called Help This Garden Grow, which is really the biggest project that Damon and I have ever taken on together. It's a multi-part audio documentary series about Hazel Johnson. Hazel Johnson is a visionary in the environmental justice movement. She's in many circles called the mother of the environmental justice movement. And she lived in Altgeld Gardens, which is a community on the far south side of the city that is in the middle of some of the most toxic industry and pollution imaginable in an area that she deemed, she called it the toxic donut. And so we've dedicated this 6-part series to telling, one, the story of her life, but really the legacy of her work and how it informs the environmental justice movement overall. So the release party for that is going to be July 27th at the Winter Garden at the Harold Washington Library. And then we're going to have other listening parties in different gardens throughout the city. And then the last project coming out in September is actually connected to something that you can hear now. It's called 1 Million Experiments. And for the last year and change, Damon and I have been co-hosting a podcast in partnership with our movement colleagues at Interrupting Criminalization and Project NIA, who are 2 wonderful national organizations. And they had built together a like an online database of experiments in reimagining safety for a world without police and prisons. So experiments that were happening all over the world, people going, how do we actually take care of each other? What do we actually need in order to be safe? And so we came to them and said, what if we make a podcast where each episode we interview a different experiment and help build the deeper understanding of the how and why of their work? And so that is already out. You can find it on the Ergo feed or just search 1 Million Experiments wherever you get your podcasts. And as part of that, we've been working with them and our collaborators at Soapbox Production and Organizing, which is another movement media org in the city, to build a experimental documentary film, pulling the audio from those interviews, found footage, gathered footage from each of the experiments we had in the first season, and then some original footage, so you get to even see Damon, me on camera, as well as many other people. And that film will be premiering around the Socialism Conference that happens the first weekend of September on Labor Day, and then will be screened all over the city. So those are our big projects, and we feel like that are going to come out in the next few months, and we feel like they're really kind of epitomize this ethic that we've been trying to build and trying to bring into our work as a way of making it more possible in the world of contribution, of divesting from despair, of building toward hope, and remembering that hope is a discipline, as Miriam Kaba says. And so I'm glad that y'all caught us at this moment where all of this is kind of ready to be shared. We're so excited to share it. And I think that is probably the most rapid fire we've ever talked about our entire professional careers before.
Yeah, right in and right out. And we got 1 minute to spare to get into question and answer. But yeah, if Lori and Van want to hop back in, if there's any questions for us, we would love to be in conversation with what folks are thinking and feeling.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to hear about all those upcoming projects. And you mentioned Tasha. I realize I'm wearing my Tasha t-shirt.
Oh, I got the merch on deck.
Today,
Love
it. Yeah, I queued that up for not
Well
sponsored
done.
by Tasha. Okay, so yeah, some questions that we have queued up here. I guess one question, you mentioned like that focus on kind of like the idea of the historical record. I guess I'm curious, like, how do you try to balance making content that is relevant in the immediate moment, but will also kind of play that longer historical role? Like, is that something that you think about when you're crafting your interview questions? And like, how do you think about kind of fulfilling both of those roles at the same time?
That's such a great question. That's literally been embedded in the DNA of all that we've done from the very beginning. But before I get going, because we can get to talking about how many questions. I want to know how deep we can respond to each question. So, is it an overflowing question, or can we swim a little bit?
I think you can swim. I think we can adapt.
All right, for sure. I want to get to as many as possible. But again, I kind of want to set the stage. We did do the very abridged version. But for me, I did the rap at the beginning. I'm a performing artist. But Ergo and Respair is the continuation and expression of participating in a Black liberation movement. And so as like I said, me and Daniel met in school. We graduated in 2014. And within 2 to 3 months of us leaving campus, the uprising and resistance in Ferguson had began after the murder of Mike Brown. And so from that, the beginning of another organization, Let Us Breathe Collective, which deeply informs and is connected to Ergo's work, came into existence. And so for me, I had just been studying all of these texts and artifacts from the 60s and 70s, from the civil rights, Black Power movement, the Black freedom movement at large. And I'm here in Chicago and am deeply impacted by Fred Hampton's legacy. And he looms almost as like a spiritual figure over our city. And so different than Angela Davis or Stokely Carmichael, as dynamic as Frederick Douglass is, Frederick Douglass, oh jeez, I'm sleepy. As dynamic as Fred Hampton is, that Frederick Douglass is also dynamic.
I thought you were about to quote Trump, be like, he's got some great work coming out.
I'm tweaking. As dynamic as Fred Hampton is, as somebody who was trying to figure out how do I continue work in his legacy, if you piece together all of the video and audio clips that exist on the internet, it comes out to less than an hour. And so, he was assassinated in 1969. So that's about 45 years before we started. The book that informs my work the most was released in 1974. So what does it look like to be 21 years old and be searching for information in text from 40 or 50 years ago? And some of it is really robust and some of it is really sparse and scarce. And the fact that Fred Hampton's likeness is so limited feels like a historical tragedy. So in every conversation that we've been having, literally since day one, one of our major audiences that we are imagining is people who want to activate 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, who are trying to look back at what was happening in the teens and 20s in Chicago, because it seemed like there was some really dynamic things going on. I would like to have a firsthand understanding that is embedded in literally every project we have made.
And I think to your question about how we balance it with kind of like a timeliness, we knew from jump that like we weren't a news current events responding to the world show. We do that from time to time, like around the November election, we did 2 episodes about the treatment not trauma ordinance. And part of the idea with that is, it can give it can be a teaching tool and a public education tool leading up to the campaign. But it's always with that eye to the archive in mind, of like that, the significance of that ordinance passing will be so much greater 20 years from now. And so to hear about the process of how that was done, even though what we were doing was, talking about it in real time, it wasn't talking about something that happened in the past. If we can accurately reflect and celebrate the work happening now, that can be of use both now in circulating in support of the campaign, but then also for people trying to understand what grew out of that. And we just acknowledge that there's a snapshot that we're giving. When we talk to artists, we're talking to them at a certain point in their career. We see them 5 years later, they're like, oh man, I can't believe I just put that album out. Or like, oh, I don't like what I was making. It's like, yeah, we didn't talk to you to tell your life story. We talked to you to talk to you in that moment where you were, because it's part of this larger context. And so that's what we're documenting, is the context of this time, not trying to tell the story of everyone's, it's not we're not doing biographies. We're doing almost like snapshot memoir, more of like an oral history. Studs Terkel is always the inspiration on my end of, he didn't tell the story of each of those people. He gave the space for them to speak towards something. And so that's what I think we try to do.
Yeah. And this intention obviously comes up for us ideologically and how we think about the show. But it also, I think, creates an ethic in how we ask questions and facilitate conversation. Because, let's say we're talking about treatment, not trauma, or we're referencing something that just happened. We have to make that accessible to people who may not be alive yet, right? Like how, if you just are using the shorthand for something that just happened last week, hey, can you name or explain that in a way that if someone hears this in 3 months or in 3 years, they will be able to access and understand what we're speaking towards. And in so doing, it actually makes it more accessible for people right now, right? Like, having that, having something just fail, having that look towards the future actually gives us a deeper ethic of care of folks who are here with us now.
So on that, I'm curious, we had another question that was, can you talk about either specific examples or methods that you use in your interviews that infuse that either hope or liberatory ethos or vision of the future?
I love the like nuts and bolts of that question. It also perfectly matches the like civic tech world that other people haven't met. It's like, what are the frameworks? What's the code? So there's a lot of things. Some of it has to do, like we said, with modeling this humanizing dialogue. So, Damon mentioned a kind of a accounting for a negative in terms of interruption, but I think there's a lot of also like affirmation. We really make a practice of like giving praise in ways that are not dishonest, but are like, hey, organizers, people doing good work, have a tendency to disavow the compliments they receive, negate them, self-demean, and we really like push people to accept the reflection back and the affirmation of the work they're doing. And I think that, one thing that I think that makes possible, even just on a personal level, is that can serve as fuel for people. I know for us in the times where we've received that, like that has been a huge motivator. And so we're trying to give that like, hey, we see you, to the people doing the work. So that's one part.
Yeah.
Dame, you have another one you want to throw in there?
Yeah, I got a couple to jump in with. And I felt this grow more with time. So we've taught against this notion of moving right along conversation. So I've been interviewed a lot, and you might share something really personal or something you really thought about or go really in depth, and you might hear this now, and the interviewer might just go, okay, and moving right along, and just go as if they did not receive or take in what they just heard. And so something that has become much more intentional and important for me is not always having to ask a question right away, especially since this pandemic has begun, right? Like, and we're talking about folks who are working with folks who've lost family members, we're folks who are addressing the needs of people suffering through poverty or environmental catastrophe or torture and incarceration. Really heavy things can get named. And what does it look like to take a second and say, oh, that's really heavy, or, oh, I'm sorry that you went through that, or, oh, I hear what you're saying. I feel that. And recognizing that I'm a human as well, and like I don't have to push through, but you're not a show pony or insert activist or artist quote here. You are a full human, and like we are acknowledging the emotionality of what we're asking you to speak to, and how do we be as vulnerable as we are inviting folks into. So that's one really important tactic. And then we actually have a tradition. One, I think it's just important to have traditions and groundings for yourself in all ways, like healthy habits, build better patterns. And so we start our conversation, and actually every workshop that we do where we're able to see the people, with asking the question, the two-part question, centered around time, in this time, and define time however you will, this day, this season, this hour, this lifetime. In this time, how is the world treating you, and how are you treating the world? And so how that question was created as a two-part started from like, oh, we need to have a grounding or a check-in or some way to come in, and just like, how's the world treating you is a very flat thing. People usually say fine, right? But then once you ask this notion of agency of, okay, you know, either the world sucks or you're really grateful, but how are you today showing up to the world? And one, folks have just say often they've never been asked that before. So one, just that as a provocation to how they orient themselves to life is very interesting. But as a way to start off the conversation, as opposed to, you know, we colloquially will say, like, you know, on the radio, you hear someone say, like, tell me about your album, tell me about your mixtape. And like, that's the start of the conversation. Like, there's no preparedness. So to see where folks are starting from and how they're showing up to the world, our questions are usually built in follow-up to what we're hearing, as opposed to a list of these predetermined outcomes that we're trying to drive or push people to get to.
And we still have things that we want to get to. Like, it's not just let's talk. Like, we're there to have a conversation around particular beats. We'll usually have 3 or 4 things throughout the conversation we want to make sure we touch on or try to. But we move at a human pace and in a human rhythm that is responsive to the person who's given us the gift of their time and energy and expertise.
Well, I feel like this is putting a lot of pressure on the fact that we have a time limit and questions coming in from the chat.
No,
so
and that reminds me of something really important that I wanted to say, which is that all of this is relative to the form that we work in, right? So when we do, for instance, those projects that we named that are coming out this summer, you know, some of them we're not on mic, we're the producers. Some of them we are, but, you know, we were asking toward more specific answers, or we knew we weren't going to be using our voices asking the question. So that shifted how we did it. So this is a very different form from a sit down hour. You're in good hands. But these are the kind of things that, like, over practice have emerged for us.
And we started on terrestrial radio where we had 59 minutes and 59 seconds and had to stop. And so, you know, and then went to having our own forum where we could go for 2 hours if we wanted to. And so some of that shifted for us. But like I was trying to pace out the questions. Let me stop. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Yeah. So another kind of maybe nuts and boltsy question from the chat. How do you find and vet your guests that you have on?
It's interesting. That's a great question. It's the question that I get almost every time that I tell people about the work we do. And it's something that doesn't feel like at first like that big of a deal for us. So the short answer is they're people that we're already in community with. And I think to some journalists that can feel like, ooh, you're violating a line, but we don't identify as journalists. We do acts of journalism sometimes, which is a phrase we got from Lewis Wallace, who's a wonderful movement journalist and writer, wrote a whole book about objectivity and subjectivity in journalism that people should check out called The View from Somewhere. But that's not how we identify. What we're doing is contributing to the community that we're already part of. And that list goes on forever, partially because Chicago is big, the world is big, there are lots of people doing good work, and also because our community has shifted over the years. You know, there are people who we were close to, who we had on, or were on our list to get to in the first 50 episodes, who, you know, it's not always a negative. Just communities shift, people step away, people different things. We moved in different directions. Like it continues to be reflective of the people who feel significant in our lives and in the work that we're seeing happening in the city. So yeah, I think that's never, what was hard was making sure we could get them to the radio station at noon. That was a challenge. And, you know, for many years we had a show that came out every week, even after we weren't on the radio. That stopped a little bit now as we've been putting the effort into these larger projects. But the who do we want to talk to? Damon and I are curious people who care deeply. And so there's an infinite number of people we want to talk to.
And there's a little bit of, if you build it, they will come in it as well. So absolutely, this began from talking to the people that we were like very deeply in connection with, like probably 8 of the first 50 I like picked up from their house, right? But in then doing that work in creating this document, and being in active conversation and participation, it then allowed us to build more relationships, right? So folks who know the people that we've had on, that then makes it, you know, we've had folks recommend someone or put us in contact. You know, you meet somebody in at a space or at an event or at a performance, and instead of just saying hi, now that I have taken the time to actually build something and have something to invite someone into. When I meet you, that's usually a part of the conversation relationship. Like, yeah, this is the work that I do. Would love to have you on sometime. And so, our network of 50 to 75 people became 300 because we, community leads to community. And then it's easier to make an ask once you've started. So, at first our intentional audience was we want the people who we have on the show to want to listen to the show. And in doing that then grew and expanded, and it gave us more access and entry to folks. The vetting conversation, there has been like once or twice that somebody's kind of come on and they may say things that just seem a little misaligned or not in flow with what we're trying to name. And so there has been times we've not aired episodes or we've
Just
produced
one ever.
twice. There was a climate change maker we didn't
Oh,
put out
right,
too.
right. Yeah.
So but that's a pretty good ratio. And so I think because we have some principles and there's like a, I don't want to say what the hard lines are, but there are some like kind of clear, obvious hard lines that don't even become possibilities. And then within that, right. So yeah, that's a difference between us and other folks. Like we are not trying to set up argument or debate, right? Like, so there is
We
value
will
in the public.
disagree.
Yeah.
And we do disagree. When we disagree with somebody, we will make space for that.
But there is value of that in the public square, the public space. But those conversations are often not generative and often just like entrench people further where they are. And so for the generative type of conversations we have, there is a shared principle value agreement that we're able to discern through how someone's moving through the world, through how we communicate, through how someone presents themselves. That is not like a like codified checklist, but is from the learnings that we've embodied from being in the spaces that we're connected to.
And there are people who we talked to at one point, and then years later we learned that they were in violation of a ethic, and that's been a challenging question for us. Of how do we acknowledge that? How do we make space not to center them having to, but our complicity, uplift, what is our responsibility there, I think is an important question. And we try to do our best of that by being transparent. And the goal of that is not to protect ourselves, it's to model and fumble through the type of reparative and generative conversations that need to be happening off mic too.
Vian, did you want to do the next one? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. We're getting a lot of questions from folks who are thinking.
That's
Good
the whole
job.
point. That was excellent.
Do some thinking out there. I'm proud of you folks.
So looking at them, there might be a few that are asking, that are asking about similar things. So maybe you want to bundle one or two.
Yeah, love a bundle.
The way that you've talked, it seems like there's like a pretty there's a continuum in like the conversations that you've had to the medium that you've chosen. So one question is like, why did you choose audio and podcasting as a primary medium for your work? And then another one that's related is, I'll just read it. Perhaps a basic question, but what all do you have in mind in terms of media? It sounds like you mostly focus on podcasts. Are there other forms of media you're focused or interested in producing?
Fantastic bundling, fantastic questions. So audio has always been a deep passion of mine. David and I both worked at the radio station in college and produced a bunch of great projects out of that. And it's just always been something that I've had a deep passion for. But the reality of why is mostly around its accessibility, both as a creator and as a listener. This is a little bit less the case now, but especially when we first started, like what it took to make film and video required so much more time, money, and as someone who's self-taught as a producer, expertise, honestly. We barely edited the first 100 shows we did. We were tighter on mic because of it, but what we were doing was making a radio show and then sharing it, as opposed to like editing and producing a podcast. And then that's shifted, and now it's highly edited and put together, but it still captures that organic flow. It was mostly about, this is what, and it's rooted actually in our organizing ethic of like, rather than being like, oh man, I want to make this thing that I don't have the capacity or the finances or the skill to make now, let me try to write 1 million grants to get the money to make this thing. It was, with the tools that we have available to us now, what can we make that serves the contribution we want to offer? And this was what I know how to make, and so I wanted to figure out how to make it in service of movement. To the second part, yes, there are many types of things that we both want to do, both more high production and less. We both have done some writing and have interest in turning some of our work, one written work, but also transcripts of some of these episodes into books and making them more accessible in that way. And then, this film project, 1 Million Experiments, is really a first step into film, and having the resources to do that.
Hopefully our first successful. We had a
Oh.
we had a really cool but very overlooked and probably not fully resourced performance interview series that would happen in front of a live studio audience at acoustic recording studio. And that was called Signal Flow, and so that was really fun. And
I forgot about it. Yeah,
right. It wasn't a success. So, and then also recently have produced and released a pilot for a video show of an aunt who organizes around police violence after losing her teenage nephew in 2016 to a shooting by the Chicago Police Department. Her name is Araywa Winters, and produced the show The Glamorous Militant, and then also have ambitions of doing other like more short form video content. But to Daniel's point, it is really much, it costs a lot more in all resources, and also there is a certain comfort that Daniel has really had a testimony around that he's really sold me over of. One, just having voice in your ear there's a certain intimacy. Also, not having people on camera when we're asking folks to be vulnerable. Like there's a certain tightened up, buttoned up thing when you have all the lights on, you got the lav mic and you don't want to move, that is different in the audio form. And so there's a level of intimacy that this space has allowed for us that we really value and cherish, and a way that listeners can engage. So, particularly folks who are on the move a lot, find themselves, on their train rides or going in between meetings or activities, listening to podcasts piece by piece in ways that, don't work the same for a TV show or a talk show that,
yeah. But it is something we're looking forward to being able to invest in to make a bigger part of what we do, especially in this new, Ergo may not always have that, but we want Respair to really have that in our toolbox, this larger umbrella org.
That makes sense. And I, as someone who doesn't do much media, I'd never thought about the big difference between video and audio. That seems obvious now, I guess. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I guess to maybe close out on some of those themes that you mentioned about asking folks to like reflect on positive feedback. One of the questions was, what are some of the best compliments for the organizing work that you've received, and what kind of acknowledgements have been genuinely supportive of you and the work that you do? So maybe we can close on that.
So to clarify, what have we received? Oh, yeah.
You got us.
Guns and guns.
That was tricky.
So for people who have been interviewed a lot, when we hear, oh, this was different from other interviews, or I felt more comfortable, or we got to a place that I never knew, or I learned something about myself, those are always
a conversation I've never had before. I've never said, but that is the biggest Ergo. Yeah.
And for listeners, totally. And for listeners, people who we run into in movement spaces who are active, working on campaigns, setting up chairs, doing organizing work, when they say that their entry point, or even if it wasn't their entry point, a like enriching, important part of their learning and activation was listening to the show, that is one of the greatest feelings in the world. That's the whole point, is we want this to invite people into action.
Yeah. That's the answer for on air. And even just sometimes people say, nice question. Like I just like when we get that, we're a second
David
to
just
say, oh, good
responds,
question.
thank you on
Yeah,
the
thank
air,
you.
which I love. People never know what to do.
Yeah. Like, oh wow, appreciate that. So definitely folks wanting to create more because of the work. So whether create their own media project or to create in the vein of the arts and organizing work that we're looking to document. And again, I want to explain that like Ergo and Respair come from us as participants in the work that we do off microphone. So just some affirmations of some of the organizing work. Similarly to on mic, folks saying that, they now dedicate their lives to liberation and abolition, and learned it from spaces that I was at or helped create, or things that I said, is really an honor that like is hard to fully understand sometimes. And then, on a deeper level, I think of folks, elders feeling cared for, children being protected. So being able to organize childcare for free, or, in 2016 did a robust effort called Freedom Square across the street from a CPD Black site where there were 7,000 cases of illegal detention and torture. There was a 12-year-old that when we finished said, I would have got locked up this summer if you weren't here. And so moments like that, and I'll end with, there's a lot of grief in this work. It is, for many of the things we're talking about, the start point or the activation point of them is tragic death and loss. And then a community has built that now know each other, and we have lost loved ones and family members and comrades and collaborators. And so being able to show up to create and make space for grief in a healthy way, because our society doesn't have it, in our public square acts like it doesn't exist. And so to tie it back to that happens off mic, but the most impactful experience in my life was losing my brother-in-law about 18 months ago, and we were able to create almost like a living obituary through audio submissions, and an honor to his legacy for his children and for his family and parents. And so hearing his family hear that piece was probably on a human spiritual level the greatest contribution and affirmation that we received. And we honor Malika Lee.
Yeah, I think you mentioned kind of trying to leave space for a sec, but unfortunately we are at time. So
it's okay.
You left it.
I'm good.
You did it perfect.
You just said it.
Okay.
You just named it. Just transparently account. That's all we can do.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No,
David, you jerk.
No,
just
I mean,
dumped the grief on you.
But that's what you were saying. I mean, that they go hand in hand, right? That the most hopeful comes from the most, like, it goes really side by side with the hard. So, yeah. So
and making people laugh.
Oh,
sorry, I'm cutting you off. That really means a lot, because we're, like you said, we're doing all this heavy, deep stuff, and we're like nerdy, big word dudes, and so comedy is really important to us. And so we make our guests laugh, or audience members say, like, you guys are funny,
or at least we try to. Yeah.
No, people say it. People, to order the affirmation, people have said it for years now. Fine. And that means a lot. All right, sorry, I'm not going to interrupt you anymore.
We're done.
No, thank you so much. This was incredible. Thank you both so much for your time and for everything that you shared. And I think with that, folks, we do have one of our own little Shy Hack Night traditions to do in a second here. But if folks want to join the post-presentation Zoom call, you can join us at the bit.ly link up on the screen. And with that, the end, I'm going to count us in. On the count of three, we will say our Shy Hack Night mantra. 1, 2, 3. Go forth and hack. Incredible. All right. Thanks everybody so much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate you.